Hi, this is Joy at Pine Quilt Shop. Today we're going to talk about how to fold and store your quilts. So I'm going to start by talking about the difference between a quilt that's completely done and quilted and bound and a quilt top that has just been pieced. Now when I fold a quilt top, one that's just been pieced, isn't quilted yet, maybe I'm getting ready to take it into the store to pick up backing, or I'm getting ready to take it to my long armor, I always fold those with the right side out and the seams in. And the reason that I do that is to protect those seams. If you have a folded quilt top and you've folded it with the seams out and you're putting it in and out of a tote bag, like I said, when you're taking it into the shop or you're taking it to your long armor, you can fray those seams out just from handling the quilt top. So if you're folding quilt tops, definitely always fold those with the right side out, the wrong side in. Now when you're folding quilts, which is our main focus today, those I always will fold completely done quilts that are quilted and bound with the right side in. And I do that to protect my quilt top. Sometimes where you store your quilts, there might be some occasional sunlight and you want to make sure that you're protecting that quilt top and keeping it in where you're not going to have any issues with fading and that type of thing from sun. It also protects it from any kind of dirt and dust in the environment, so I always fold it with my quilt top in. Now normally when you're folding a quilt, the key is to fold it on the bias. Now you have to think about your quilt, but generally speaking, you're gonna for the most part have straight of grain going this direction and straight of grain going this direction, and your bias is going to be on the diagonal with most quilts. So in general, you want to fold on that bias grain on the diagonal. So with a table runner like this, a small item, I would usually start by doing something like this, and then I would fold that down, and I would fold this way. And at this point, if I wanted to, I could also go ahead and fold it in half in the middle, and that middle is also on the bias angle. So that is how I would typically fold a small table runner like this. This particular runner though is an exception to the rule, and we're going to talk about that exception. This runner has applique blocks on both ends, and the applique was done with fusible web. When I have applique done with fusible web, I will normally try not to fold those blocks, because if it goes into storage and it's in storage for a while, you can really get some set-in creases in that area where the fusible web is. Now if you're doing needle turn applique, it's not an issue because you don't have the webbing, and the webbing is what kind of holds the creases. So I would typically, with a runner like this that has those fusible web appliques blocks on the end, I would break the bias rule and I would go ahead and I would fold it and store it with it folded on the straight of grain. Now when I fold on the straight of grain, I'm going to get more set in creases where those folds are, but pressing those creases out here is preferable to trying to press them out on my applique blocks. So if you have applique blocks, definitely think about that and try to fold so you're not folding those blocks. So we're going to move on now to a larger quilt and talk about how to fold a larger quilt. And I'm going to show you a couple options for this. The first option that I'm going to show you works pretty well if you have quilts that are wall hanging, small throws. It will work fairly well for that. And what I will simply do is to start by flipping one of my corners in. So I'm establishing that bias fold line, and I'll flip one corner in, and then I can just simply flip my way across the quilt. If you have a little bit longer quilt, you might want to do some folding in from the other side as well. But if you don't have a huge quilt, you can simply flip your way across the quilt, continuing to fold on that bias. And I'm going to flip this corner back so that it's a little bit easier and I don't have to make another roll. Well, I may have to make another roll. We're going to do one more. There we go. It's a little bit too big. So when you have it folded like that, then you can simply flip your ends in and you are ready to take it to your storage area. Now the fold that I did and the size that I did works really well for the people who store quilts in like a spare bedroom closet. We have a lot of people that use that top shelf in a spare bedroom closet for their quilts, and this fold works well for that. If you are putting it on a storage shelf or a different type storage unit, you're going to want to think about where it's going to go and fold it at an appropriate size. If you had a storage shelf, you would probably want to fold a little wider, so you can adjust for that as you go. The one thing that I always mention that works well is to use your mat when you're folding. If you know you have a shelf that's approximately 12 inches wide or 18 inches wide, you can lay the quilt when you make that first turn. You can line it up with the baseline on your cutting mat, and you can look and say, okay, I'm folding it at about 9 inches wide, and you know it's going to get a little bigger as you roll, but do keep that in mind. Use your cutting mat to measure as you go, and that is one option that works for kind of medium-sized quilts. Now if you have a really large bed quilt, then my recommended option is the next one that I'm going to show you, and it is to fold completely back. So you're going to basically take a corner of a quilt, you're going to fold it on the diagonal, and you will fold the entire quilt back. Now this quilt is not a square quilt, so you can see I've got a little bit of end hanging out there, and that's okay. But I've established that bias fold to get me started. So then I can flip back, and again, if I was going to use my mat, I would pull it back so it was at my baseline, and right now I'm folding at approximately 12 inches. Now I'm going to fold this one a little differently. We're going to fold it at about 16 inches, and I'm using my mat to measure. I will flip this down, and at this point I can fold the quilt in half, and if I had a really big quilt I would probably fold it in half again and then again. This one is not that big, so I'm going to do thirds. So I'm going to flip it back, and I'm going to flip it back and just fold it in 3 after that first initial fold. And this is another option for folding your quilts. You can fold them in any size with either folding option, but when you fold it at this size, this works pretty well to place them on your shelf or your storage unit. Again, folding at a size that's appropriate for where you're planning to store it. But it's a nice option to consider storing them vertically rather than horizontally. When you store your quilts horizontally, and you've got 5 or 6 quilts here, that poor guy on the bottom gets kind of crushed because he's got a lot of weight from his buddies piling up on top of him. If you flip your quilts like this and store them this way, the nice thing then is that they're not getting crushed because they're lined up kind of like books on a shelf, and you don't have them getting crushed by the weight of the books of quilts above them. The other nice thing too is it's much easier to get them out. So if you have 5 quilts stored like this, that guy on the bottom could be a challenge to get out. If you have 5 quilts stored in a line like this, they're all easy to get to. So definitely think about reworking your storage area if you can to have them stored vertically like this. It'll be easier on your quilts and easier for you. So the other thing is, do you want to put them inside something when you store them? I recommend a pillowcase if you want to have them covered. It depends on where you're storing them. If you're storing them in a closet where there's no light exposure and there's no dust or pet hair or anything like that floating around, then you probably don't really need to cover them, and it's nice to be able to just quickly see and grab. If you have them in an area where there is more dust, pet hair, possible light exposure if they're not in a closet per se, then covering them is a good plan. One option is to just buy basic white pillowcases, label the pillowcase. If you have spare blocks, that's kind of a fun way to go ahead and sew those spare blocks on the cuff of even a purchased pillowcase so that you have some idea what's inside it. It can be part of your labeling system. Or if you have scraps left from your quilt, make a pillowcase out of the scraps. And then when you put this inside that storage case, you know what it is. So it's a good way to maybe use up some of your scraps from a quilt, is to make storage cases, just like a smaller size pillowcase, with your scraps to store your quilts in. So definitely, if you have them in an area where they have some possible exposure to light, light or dust or pet hair, consider putting it in a case. But definitely try to, I think, figure out if you have a way you can store them like this, because it definitely is easier on your quilts than having them in a stack. So that's what we have for tips and tricks for you today. Thanks for joining us.